The shovel cracks against frozen dirt. My name on a headstone I never ordered. Sarah's flashlight trembles, but her voice doesn't. Two men in tactical gear lunge from the fog, and I swing the iron like my life depends on it. Because it does. The key card I ripped from his vest is my only way into the manor, but the coffin I just pried open holds my face, preserved in amber gel. Sarah doesn't scream. She whispers, "Better than the last one." The ground beneath me isn't just dirt. It's a grave. And I'm standing on it. The iron head of the shovel bit into the frozen Massachusetts earth with a jarring, metallic crack. Elias Thorne felt the shock travel up his arms, vibrating through his elbows and settling into his chest. The air was a heavy, gray wool blanket that muffled the world, smelling of damp granite and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching snowstorm. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He adjusted his grip, his fingers numb inside his leather gloves, and slammed the blade down again. 1, 2, 3, 4. He paused, his breath hitching in a jagged plume of white vapor. He stepped back and tapped the wooden handle of the shovel 4 times with his knuckles. The ritual was a tether, the only thing keeping his mind from drifting into the fog that choked the Thorne family cemetery. He looked at the headstone again. It was a slab of local gray granite, jagged and unyielding, looking as though it had clawed its way out of the soil. The name carved into the stone was his own, Elias Thorne. Beneath it, the birth date matched his exactly. The death date was tomorrow. "Elias, please," Sarah Miller whispered. She stood 5 feet away. "Not 4, he noted with a prickle of irritation, holding a heavy maglite. The beam of the flashlight trembled, cutting a yellow path through the mist. "We should go. If the caretaker finds us, or if Michael sees you out here, he'll use this. He'll say you finally snapped. I snapped when I saw 6 of them, Sarah." Elias rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He kicked a clod of frozen dirt aside. 6 graves, all with my name, all with different years. My uncle didn't leave me an inheritance. He left me a riddle written in headstones. I am going to see what's in this box, or I am going to die trying. He lunged back into the work, the rhythmic thud crunch of the shovel the only sound in the suffocating silence. The trees around the perimeter of the estate were bent at a precise 45-degree angle, leaning away from the manor as if trying to flee a wind no one else could feel. Elias felt that same pressure now, a weight on his lungs that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. He dug until the shovel struck something that didn't sound like stone or dirt. It was a hollow, wooden thud, the sound of a final resting place. Sarah's breath hitched. "You found it." "I found something," Elias said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He began to clear the dirt faster, his movements frantic, driven by a desperate, cold logic. He had to know. If there was a body down there, he was a madman. If there wasn't, the world was a lie. The flashlight beam suddenly jerked away from the hole, sweeping toward the line of twisted oaks. Sarah's boots crunched on the frost. "Elias, someone's here." The sound of an engine reached them, a low, predatory growl that vibrated in the soles of Elias's feet. A black SUV tore up the gravel path, its headlights slicing through the fog like twin blades. Before the vehicle even came to a complete stop, the doors flew open. 2 men in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadows and high collars, lunged from the brush. They didn't shout commands. They didn't identify themselves. They moved with a silent, practiced lethality that told Elias they weren't security guards. They were cleaners. "Run!" Sarah screamed. But Elias didn't move toward the woods. The logic of the courtroom, the cold calculation of a litigator, took over. He couldn't outrun them in the mud. He had to neutralize the threat. As the first man reached the edge of the pit, Elias swung the heavy iron shovel in a wide, horizontal arc. The flat of the blade caught the attacker in the ribs, with a sickening crack of breaking bone. The man grunted. The sound forced out of him like air from a punctured tire, and he crumpled into the frozen weeds. The second man was faster, tackling Elias around the waist and sending them both tumbling into the open grave. The smell of wet earth and ancient rot filled Elias's nostrils. He felt a gloved hand clamp over his mouth, smelling of gun oil and peppermint. He thrashed, his knuckles finding the man's throat. They rolled in the mud, a frantic scramble of limbs and heavy breathing. Elias felt a hard, plastic shape against the man's chest, a tactical vest. With a surge of adrenaline, he hooked his fingers under a lanyard and yanked. A heavy plastic card snapped free. Elias drove his knee into the man's groin and shoved him back into the darkness of the pit. The attackers didn't stay to finish the fight. The sound of a whistle echoed from the manor, and the two men retreated as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the shadows of the SUV. The engine roared, tires spinning on the gravel, and then they were gone, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the ringing silence of the cemetery. Elias stood in the half-dug grave, his suit ruined, his hands shaking as he looked at the high-security electronic keycard in his palm. It was matte black, embossed with a silver hawk, the Thorne family crest. "Are you hurt?" Sarah was at the edge of the pit, her face a pale mask of terror. "I'm fine," Elias said, though his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. He turned back to the coffin. The struggle had cleared the last of the dirt from the lid. It wasn't traditional oak. It was a dark, polished composite material that looked more like a jewelry box than a casket. He jammed the edge of the shovel into the seam of the lid and leaned his entire weight into it. The wood groaned, a sound like a rusted hinge, and then the seal broke with a wet, suctioning pop. Elias didn't find bones. He didn't find a shroud. The interior of the coffin was lined with a shimmering metallic foil and filled to the brim with a thick, amber-colored gel. It looked like honey, but it smelled of ozone and sterile chemicals. Suspended in the fluid, perfectly preserved, was a man. Elias felt the world tilt. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and brushed the gel away from the man's face. The skin underneath was cool and yielding, like high-quality silicone. The features were unmistakable. The sharp, analytical brow, the slight indentation on the chin, the birthmark on the left temple, shaped like a jagged map of the estate. It was Elias, not a relative, not a twin. It was a biological duplicate, an identical version of himself, frozen in a moment of artificial sleep. He looked younger, perhaps 25, his skin unlined by the stress of the last decade. "He looks—" Sarah started, her voice devoid of the scream Elias expected. She stepped closer, the flashlight beam steady now, illuminating the duplicate's closed eyelids. She reached out and touched the gel, her expression shifting from horror to a strange, clinical appreciation. "He looks better than the last one, Elias. The skin tone is more natural. They fixed the cellular degradation around the eyes." Elias froze. His hand, still hovering over his own dead face, went rigid. He turned to look at Sarah, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the body with the eyes of a farmer inspecting a prize crop. "The last one," Elias whispered. Sarah finally looked up. The warmth he had known for 20 years The friend who had held his hand at his mother's funeral, the woman he had trusted with every secret, was gone. Her eyes were unlinking, predatory. Don't be dramatic, Elias. You knew the math didn't add up. The illnesses, the disappearances, the way you always felt like a stranger in your own skin. It wasn't a mystery. It was a manufacturing defect. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her voice dropping into a calm, rhythmic lilt. You're a thorn, Elias, but you aren't the first. And if you'd just stayed in the house and taken your vitamins, you wouldn't have had to see how the sausages are made. The betrayal hit Elias harder than the shovel's impact. He looked from the girl he loved to the body in the box, and then to the key card in his hand. The logic was clear now, even if his heart refused to accept it. He wasn't an heir. He was an asset. And his expiration date was less than 24 hours away. The transition from the graveyard to the manor felt like moving from one chamber of a heart to another. The fog followed them, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains of the foyer as Elias stepped inside. He didn't speak to Sarah. He couldn't. She walked behind him, her heels clicking on the marble floor with a metronomic precision that made his skin crawl. Elias, thank God you're back. Michael Davis stepped out of the shadows of the library. The family attorney looked exactly as he always did. Rigid, perfectly tailored, his silver-rimmed spectacles gleaming under the chandelier. He held a leather portfolio in one hand and his silver-plated hourglass in the other. He flipped the glass. The hiss of the sand was the only sound in the room. You've been busy, Michael said, his eyes scanning Elias's mud-caked clothes. Digging where you shouldn't. It's a symptom, Elias. A clear sign of the neurodegenerative decline we've all been worried about. I found the grave, Michael, Elias said, his voice level, though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. I found the body. Explain the gel. Explain why Sarah is talking about iterations. Michael didn't blink. He opened the portfolio and slid a heavy, cream-colored document onto the mahogany table. I don't have to explain anything to a man who is no longer legally a person. This is an injunction, Elias, signed by a judge 2 hours ago. Given your recent erratic behavior, the trespassing, the delusions regarding your identity, the court has found you mentally incompetent. Control of the Thorne estate, the trusts, and all biological patents has been transferred to my firm. Elias looked at the document. The seal was real. The signatures were valid. They weren't just killing him. They were erasing his right to exist before the heart even stopped beating. You have 48 hours until your birthday, Michael said, his voice as cold as the granite outside. We had hoped for a peaceful transition, a quiet handover. But if you insist on being difficult, we have protocols for damaged goods. I'm leaving, Elias said. He turned for the door, his mind already racing toward his car, toward the gates, toward the police in the next town. I wouldn't, Michael called out. Elias ignored him. He burst through the front doors and ran toward his silver sedan, parked in the circular drive. He fumbled with his keys, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He hit the unlock button. Nothing happened. The lights didn't flash. The doors remained locked. He lunged for the driver's side window and peered inside. The dashboard was dark. He looked down at the front of the car and saw a pool of dark, viscous fluid spreading across the gravel. He knelt, his fingers touching the liquid. It was oil. He looked through the grille and saw the jagged remains of the engine block. It hadn't been tampered with, it had been gutted. The wires were shredded, the battery gone. He looked toward the main gates, a quarter-mile down the driveway. The massive iron bars were shut. He could see the red glow of the electronic locks, a silent signal that the estate had become a cage. He was trapped on 100 acres of frozen dirt, with a woman who recorded his apologies and a lawyer who measured his life in sand. He retreated back into the house, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind him. The foyer felt different now. The air was vibrating. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to echo through the floorboards. It was the grandfather clock in the corner. The pendulum didn't swing. It pulsed. The tick-tock wasn't a sound. It was a pressure in his ears, a high-frequency whine that made his vision blur. He stumbled toward the library, his hands over his ears. As he passed the portrait of Elias Thorne, the original patriarch, the heavy gold frame groaned. The painting tilted, sliding down the wall to reveal a dark, circular void in the plaster. A camera lens, cold and unblinking, stared back at him. He wasn't being watched. He was being monitored, like a specimen in a lab. "Get away from me," Elias shouted as Bill Higgins, the groundskeeper, rounded the corner. Bill didn't speak. He never did. He was a mountain of a man, smelling of damp earth and motor oil, humming a low, distorted nursery rhyme. He held a heavy iron poker in one hand, the tip glowing dull red from the fireplace. He swung without warning. Elias dropped to the floor, the iron bar whistling over his head and shattering a Ming vase on the pedestal behind him. The litigator's mind, the part of him that anticipated an opponent's next move before they even made it, kicked into high gear. He didn't try to overpower the bigger man. He waited for the next swing. As Bill lunged, Elias stepped into the man's guard, using his shoulder to throw Bill off balance. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the sideboard and slammed it into the side of the groundskeeper's head. Bill grunted, his knees buckling. Elias didn't wait for him to recover. He shoved the man toward the kitchen, kicking the pantry door open and heaving Bill inside. He slammed the heavy bolt home, the metal screeching as it slid into place. Bill began to pound on the wood, the thud, thud, thud echoing the rhythm of the clock. Elias leaned against the door, gasping for air. He pulled the black keycard from his pocket. He needed answers. He needed the truth, not the legal fiction Michael was peddling. He ran back to the study, to the wall safe hidden behind the collection of first editions. He pressed the keycard against the sensor. A spark erupted, a small blue flash that smelled of scorched dust, and the lock clicked. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside was a single, leather-bound book, the Thorne Ledger. Elias opened it, his eyes scanning the columns of names and numbers. It wasn't a record of wealth. It was a list of investors, senators, CEOs, local judges. Next to each name was a date and a product code. Senator Higgins, lungs, November 14th. Judge Miller, heart, 03/22. And then, the map, a hand-drawn diagram of the estate garden. 6 red dots marked the graves he had seen. A 7th dot, circled in black, was located directly beneath the garden shed. It's a beautiful system, isn't it? Sarah stood in the doorway. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding her phone, her thumb moving rhythmically across the screen. "You're a crop, Elias," she said, her voice devoid of malice. It was worse. It was bored. The Thorne DNA is unique. It doesn't reject. It doesn't scar. You are the ultimate insurance policy for the people who run this state. They give the Thorne family protection, and in return, every 33 years, we provide a fresh harvest. 33, Elias whispered. The age of the last one in the grave. The cells start to break down after that, Sarah said, stepping into the room. She smelled of lilies and ozone. The quality drops. We can't have the senator receiving a degraded product, can we? She looked at him, and for a second, Elias saw a flicker of something human in her eyes. A brief, dying spark of the girl he thought he knew. I'm sorry, Elias. Truly. I'll add it to the list. She turned her phone screen toward him. A spreadsheet. 4,112 entries. The last one, time-stamped 10 seconds ago, read, Elias Thorne. Sincerity level, high. You're not a person to them, Sarah, Elias said, his voice trembling. You're just the help. What happens when you get old? When you're no longer useful? I don't get old, Sarah said. And for the first time, she smiled. It was a wide, terrifying expression that didn't reach her eyes. I've already been promised a slot in the next cycle. I'm not the handler, Elias. I'm the successor. The night air was a physical blow, a wall of cold that made Elias's teeth ache. He ran through the garden, the rotting scent of lilies cloying in his throat. He didn't head for the gates. He headed for the shed. The ledger had been specific. The 7th dot. The source. He burst into the dilapidated wooden structure, the smell of fertilizer and old grease thick in the air. He kicked aside a stack of peat moss, revealing a floor of heavy, reinforced plywood. He found the seam and pried it up. Beneath the wood was a steel hatch, identical to the one in the study. He pressed the keycard to the sensor. The lights in the shed flickered, a low hum vibrating through the floor, and the hatch hissed open. Going somewhere? Michael Davis stood at the entrance of the shed. He had discarded his coat, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean, hard muscle. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a wolf in a pinstripe suit. You're a persistent asset, Elias, Michael said. I'll give you that. But your time is up. The sand has run out. He lunged, his movements a blur of practiced violence. Elias met him halfway, the two men crashing into the wall of garden tools. A rack of shovels collapsed, the metal clattering like skeletal applause. Michael was stronger, his hands finding Elias's throat, his thumbs pressing into the windpipe with a professional, lethal pressure. Elias clawed at the man's face, his vision beginning to gray at the edges. His hand brushed against the workbench, his fingers closing around a cold, wooden handle. A garden trowel. He didn't think. He drove the sharpened metal blade into Michael's shoulder. The attorney screamed, a raw, animal sound that shattered the stillness of the night. He slumped back, his hand clutching the wound as dark blood began to soak through his white shirt. Elias didn't stay to finish it. He scrambled toward the hatch and dropped into the dark. He fell 10 feet, landing on a hard, sterile floor. The air here was different. Bitterly cold, exactly 34 degrees, smelling of bleach and electricity. He was in a hallway of white tile and brushed steel. Above him, the hatch hissed shut, locking with a finality that made his heart sink. He followed the hum of machinery, his breath coming in jagged plumes. He turned a corner and stopped. The room was a cathedral of glass and chrome. In the center, surrounded by a forest of glowing monitors and humming vats, was a single, massive cylinder of reinforced acrylic. Inside, suspended in a web of tubes and wires, was a man. He was ancient. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched so thin over his bones that he looked like a skeleton draped in wet paper. His eyes were open, darting back and forth with a frantic, mindless energy. Click, 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 clat. The sound came from the man's mouth, a rhythmic clicking of the tongue against the roof of the pallet. Morse code. Jedediah, Elias whispered. The original. The source. He wasn't a patriarch. He was a parasite. He was the one they were all dying for. His DNA was the blueprint, the perfect sequence that the investors used to patch their own failing bodies. Elias looked at the monitors. His own face stared back at him from a dozen different angles. Asset 1.7. Status, critical. Extraction readiness, 98%. He looked at the final screen, a live feed of the garden above. A crew of men in orange vests were moving across the lawn. A cement truck was idling near the cemetery. They were already pouring the foundation for the 7th grave. Elias, stop! Sarah's voice echoed through the lab's intercom system, sounding tinny and detached. You can't win. The system is automated. The moment you entered the lab, the biological signature was locked. The extraction begins in 10 minutes. The doors at the far end of the lab hissed shut. A heavy, transparent partition slid down from the ceiling, sealing Elias in the central chamber with the stasis pod. He heard a faint hiss, the sound of air being pumped out. The vacuum will preserve the organs, Sarah said. It's a cleaner process, less trauma to the tissue. Just lie down, Elias. Make it easy. Elias slumped against the glass of Jedediah's tank. His lungs were already beginning to strain, the air thinning with every second. He looked at the old man. Click, click, click. Jedediah's eyes locked onto his. There was no soul in them, only hunger. Elias looked at the keycard in his hand. He looked at the cooling pipes running into the base of the stasis pod. The logic clicked into place. The system required a living Thorne to maintain the anchor, a current version to act as a bridge for the data transfer. If there was no bridge, the system would collapse. He lunged for the main console, his fingers flying across the keypad. He didn't need a password. He had the keycard. He jammed the plastic into the manual override slot. What are you doing? Sarah's voice lost its composure. Elias, if you damage the cooling system, the whole facility will vent. Good, Elias gasped, his vision swimming. Let it burn. He triggered the sequence. A series of red lights began to flash, and a deep, guttural groan echoed through the floor. The temperature in the lab began to rise, not by degrees, but by dozens. The thermite stabilizers in the power core were failing. Elias, stop. We can talk about this. You can be an investor. We can skip the extraction. Elias didn't answer. He slumped to the floor, his eyes fixed on the ancient man in the tank. Jedediah's clicking had stopped. For the first time in a century, the patriarch looked afraid. The world exploded in a roar of white heat. Elias woke to the sound of water. Plink, plink, plink. It was a rhythmic, hammering sound that vibrated in his skull. He was face down in a tunnel of wet concrete, the space so narrow that the ceiling pressed against his spine like a closing jaw. He smelled mud, sewage, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke. He dragged himself forward, his fingers clawing at the slick walls. He found the braille inscriptions the ledger had mentioned, the old drainage tunnels from the original 18th century deed, the tunnels that didn't exist on the modern maps. He crawled for what felt like miles, his muscles screaming, his mind a blur of fire and glass. When he finally reached the end, a rusted iron grate overlooking a ravine, he collapsed onto the wet grass. He looked back toward the estate. The manor was gone. A massive, jagged hole had opened in the earth, swallowing the house, the garden, and the laboratory into a maw of smoke and twisted metal. Blue flames flickered in the depths of the sinkhole, the last of the chemicals burning away. The Thorne legacy wasn't a family. It was a fire, and it had finally run out of fuel. Elias stood up, his legs shaking. He began to walk. He didn't look for Sarah. He didn't look for Michael. He walked toward the horizon, toward the gray light of dawn. He reached a truck stop 3 miles away, a vast, empty expanse of asphalt under a single, buzzing neon sign. The smell of diesel fumes was the most beautiful thing he had ever inhaled. It smelled of the world, of motion, of life. He walked into the restroom and splashed cold water on his face. He looked into the mirror. He expected to see a ghost. He expected to see a clone. Instead, he saw a man. His hair was matted with mud. His eyes were bloodshot and weary. But the analytical sharpness was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying uncertainty. He reached out and touched the glass. No one tapped back. He walked out to the parking lot. A massive semi-truck was idling near the pumps, its engine a low, steady heartbeat. The driver, a man in a faded baseball cap with a 1,000-yard stare, was climbing into the cab. "Hey," Elias called out. The driver paused, his hand on the door. "Yeah? Which way you headed?" "West," the man said. "I don't make left turns. It's a long way around, but it gets you there." Elias looked at the road. The sun was just beginning to crest the trees, a sliver of gold breaking through the Massachusetts gray. It was his 33rd birthday. According to the stone in the garden, he should be dead. According to the ledger, he should be a collection of parts in a senator's chest. He climbed into the passenger seat. The cab smelled of stale coffee and old upholstery. "I'm Elias," he said. The driver didn't ask for a last name. He didn't ask where he'd come from. He just shifted the truck into gear, the heavy machinery groaning as they pulled out onto the highway. "Nice to meet you, Elias," the driver said. "I'm James. Hope you like the long way." Elias looked out the window as the Thorne estate vanished in the rearview mirror. He didn't have a social security number. He didn't have a bank account. He didn't have a history. He reached out and touched the dashboard. He didn't tap it 4 times. He didn't count his siblings. He just rested his hand on the warm plastic and watched the sun rise on a day that didn't belong to anyone but him. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a threat. It was a blank page, and Elias Thorne was finally ready to write.